Greetings, legendary listeners. Welcome to the Marvelous TV Club, your headquarters for the most insightful and entertaining discussions of the latest episode of Marvel television. And that means it's time to talk about the tale of suspense known as Loki, Episode 5, Journey into Mystery. There are a lot of podcasts that talk about Marvel TV, but what separates the Marvelous TV Club from the pack is the way we organize our approach. We divide our analysis of each Marvel TV episode into 3 shows with 3 lenses that help us focus our discussions and make it easier to retain information. Pondervision is dropping every single Saturday during Loki. This is where Jesse Taylor and I explore the most captivating conundrums of the episode. We tease out their implications for the MCU and for our own reality. We're going to talk about enchantment as a power set, Easter eggs like that Thanos helicopter you might have noticed, and a ton more. On Monday, our character cast with Christine Kippens will get inside the minds of our favorite characters. I'm talking about Loki, Sylvie, Loki, Alligator Loki, and President Loki. Oh, and the return of my man, Mobius. Look, the poly relationship options feel realer than ever between the 3 of them, so just hold out hope, gang, if that's your jam. But as always, we begin our analysis with this show, our Storycast. This is where we break down the latest episode of Marvel TV, not by plot, but by themes, tropes, genres, and archetypes. It's one of the most unique analysis shows anywhere, and you can only get it here on the Marvelous TV Club. Now, remember, we've got some merch on the site. It's coming down to the last week if you want that Loki logo. Maeve's wearing one of the shirts right now as we record. It looks pretty awesome. Hit the website, marveloustvclub.com. You'll jump right over into the Teespring page. You can order all that stuff. And if you want something that you don't see for the next go-around of a show, leave us a note in a 5-star review, and we'll do our best to make that happen for Ms. Marvel. Maybe even for What If. At any rate, I am your multi-hyphenate host, producer, editor, social media maven, and more, Mark Folletti. And as always on Storycast, I'm joined by our 2 story experts.
I'm Amanda Marcotte. I am a politics writer for Salon.com, and I chronicle the end of the world every week there.
I am Maeve Adams. I am professor of English literature at Manhattan College, where I also direct the Digital Arts and Humanities program.
Now, do either of you smarty pants know the story of that Navy warship that dropped in as the USS Eldridge? Do either of you know the backstory of why that thing showed up in the void at the end of time?
I don't know, but I'm dying to know.
Is this a Cthulhu thing?
Yes, Cthulhu is real. I have some really bad news for folks. No. So there's this urban legend about the USS Eldridge from 1943, which I garnered from Wikipedia and also the site Games Radar, which any of our Pondervision listeners know is apparently where all the best articles are on all these like little Easter eggs that keep coming up. But the USS Eldridge was rumored to be a cloaked ship. They were experimenting with cloaking technology in World War II, is the rumor. And the ship, supposedly in 1943, while sitting in Philadelphia's harbor, disappeared when they tried to activate their cloaking technology, only to reappear later in Virginia and then appear back in Philadelphia. And of course, this is all almost total nonsense. The ship logs show that it was likely in Brooklyn at the time. The captain of the ship was like, no, none of this at all happened. But it became known as the Philadelphia experiment. And the idea was supposedly they were coming up with a way to make a battleship invisible. Now, there might be a kernel of truth here, which is that they were experimenting with ways to use electricity to make ships invisible to torpedoes, right? That's a little different, yeah. Makes a little more sense that there might have been some version of some form of this tale that's actually real. But there's a big old urban legend behind the USS Eldridge. So I recommend if folks are curious about some of these Easter eggs to keep digging, because I thought that was a really fun one.
Well, they're definitely not invisible to smoke monsters.
Yeah. That was pretty clear. But yeah, I feel bad for those guys.
I love the fact that they just show up and start, they're like, oh, right, like there's a big baddie thing out there. We're not going to stop and inquire about it. Like, this is the war machine, right? Like, you see something crazy, you blow it the fuck up.
Are you questioning the valor and the responsiveness of our fighting men?
No, I wouldn't dare do that. How many days? What is it? Like 3 days after the 4th of July? I know, I'm so unpatriotic. I did dye my hair blue for the 4th of July, guys. So
that's extremely cool. No, look, I give them a pass. That was a giant smoke monster. It had smoke fangs. It had
looked real
glowing
bad.
eyes. We're not going to have
Scary.
a dialogue with the giant smoke monster. If I ever walk out my front door and the giant smoke monster is there, I mean, I might try to talk to it because I have no giant cannons on me at any given moment, but that's only as a last resort. If I had weaponry, I might be inclined to use it if I spotted a giant smoke monster.
They probably thought it was a Nazi smoke monster.
Fair.
Great point,
I mean, it
great
looked
point.
really evil with the red eyes and the
Yeah.
like red mouth and the monstrous coming at you with teeth, So yeah, sure. I mean, I would just run away. I'm like a cat. I'm like, danger, run.
Yeah, that's wise. But, we're not on battleships. So who can know what was in the minds of 1943 Navy shipmen. So, of course, we are not here to talk about lies of naval history. We are here to talk about the themes of this episode of Loki. We're going to definitely explore one of those, but we're going to begin with a slightly different idea about how to look at this series and specifically a lot of what happened here in episode 5. Because Maeve, you texted me something that was quite an aha moment after you watched it. So I want to start there. Tell us what the big idea was that you took away after watching Loki episode 5.
I realized something at the end of this episode that I had started having some suspicions about, but didn't have a lot of good evidence for in the last episode, just a few shreds that became much clearer to me in this episode. Namely that Loki as a show, particularly in these episodes where they go to purgatory, is offering up a kind of reimagining of Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy.
So tell me a little bit just at the top, briefly, for folks who don't know, just about the Divine Comedy. Most folks might have heard about it. It involves a trip to hell, all that sort of thing. But I haven't read it. Amanda, have you read it?
No, I not in Italian or English.
Yeah, it's a little dense, so I confess it's not been on my list. So just give folks a quick little summary if you can.
Yeah, just a quick primer on the story. It's basically a story of a guy, Dante, it's fiction, right? He finds himself in the middle of a forest and doesn't know how he's gotten there or what's going on. And out of nowhere, Virgil, the classical poet.
Wait, you're sure this is fiction? Because Virgil shows up all the time, man.
I know, and he's like always real.
I just saw him hanging out on the street corner drinking a beer the other day.
I heard he was behind the Philadelphia experiment.
He probably was. Yeah, he's like, I don't know, Forrest Gump or something. So Virgil shows up and is like, hey, cool dude, no worries, you're okay. I'm here to guide you. And what comes after that is an adventure, an epic quest, if you will, through the 3 parts of a spiritual universe: the Inferno or Hell, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. And Virgil guides Dante through Hell and Purgatory, and then Dante gets picked up in Paradise by Beatrice, who is his love. And Dante here is Dante, but is not really Dante. It's like a poetic rendering of Dante.
So I've seen the name written down. It's spelled like Beatrice, right? Like Beatrice. You pronounce it. Yeah. Can you say that again for me?
It's Beatrice.
Beatrice.
In the old and current Italian.
Okay.
Yeah, you wouldn't say, that makes sense that you wouldn't say Beatrice in Italian.
Yeah, no, as soon as you said that, I was like, oh, that's cool.
I mean, I haven't read it, but I've read bits and snatches of it. And certainly if you know what's placed in Western civilization, it's pretty clear the imagery of like the kind of descending into this other world owes a lot to Dante. Yeah.
And, it's actually a key generic feature of all epic quest narratives. Dante really solidifies it for the modern world, but it happens in the Odyssey too. The trip to hell is kind of a crucial component in medieval literature, in the Morte d'Arthur, in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, right? The trip to hell is kind of a key component of epic quest, where the hero makes a discovery about his spiritual faith and then continues on in a journey of sort of solidifying that faith and an understanding of the way the material world, the world of culture and politics intersects with the spiritual world.
So, but beyond like going into this other world, how does it make you think about Dante's Divine Comedy?
Yeah, so like I said, my suspicions about this started in the last episode, and largely because the punishment, right, for Loki for according to Mobius not telling the truth, and or just being being willing to collaborate with him, is that punishment is a repetition of some one worst moment of your life, right? Mm-hmm. And that is something that very explicitly we see in the Inferno, that those who are cast into hell for their sins are forced to repeat over and over and over again these betrayals of faith. And so there's a way of reading this punishment for Loki as a repetition of the violation, right? And it's not, because what's fascinating about that moment is that, and the set of moments that just happen over and over again for him, is that what's horrible about that is not simply that he gets kneed in the balls over and over again. Yeah, that's probably very painful.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, maybe, I feel like that definitely is horrible, but yes.
Yeah, I feel like that really resonates for him. But what it triggers also is a recognition of his guilt, right? Yeah. He says, he keeps saying to her, like, I know, I'm a horrible person, right? I get it, right?
And his shame.
Yeah, exactly.
That he is such a small and petty person when he thought he had glorious purpose.
Right. And that's the thing that happens in the Divine Comedy, is that as Dante goes through the rings of hell in the Inferno, which is what happens, he sort of descends through the rings of hell before he ends up being able to go to purgatory. The thing that he realizes is that it's not that these people don't know what they've done wrong. In fact, they're able to reflect upon it. They know what they've done wrong. It's just they can't escape the crime. So over and over, and it's not like they necessarily have a whole ton of self-awareness. They know what they've done. They're able to reflect on it to some extent, but their repentance means nothing now, because in life they did not repent. In life they did not transform themselves, did not become more faithful people. They just continued their life of gluttony or avarice or whatever other sort of deadly sin they've perpetrated on Earth.
Roger that. So this started for you last episode with the time cell and Sif and all of that. What about this episode? What about episode 5?
Yeah, so I had this epiphany moment, which I didn't text you until after I finished watching the episode. But, one of the things about both Loki and the Divine Comedy is that they're stories about getting saved from eternal reflection on your sins or crimes or whatever. But they're more than that. They're also stories about refugees who are looking for a way home. Whatever home is. For Dante, it's paradise. For Loki, it's finding a place in the world that's not where he doesn't have to run any longer. Loki is a story about people in exile. These are political refugees. I said this last time because I was like, I feel like there's something here about refugees. That everybody is a refugee on the time continuum, because they've all been stolen from their own times and cast into this time that isn't their own with a purpose that isn't their own. So that scene where all the Lokis are debating their fate. This is after bad Loki has shown up and they realize they've been betrayed, and they're out in the world and they're traipsing around, and basically Loki is trying to persuade them that they don't have to just keep running, that they could defeat Alioth and maybe they could get beyond this space and this purgatory. And the other Lokis are kind of resigned to the fact that this is where they're stuck.
Yeah, hell is hopelessness.
Hell is hopelessness. It is, and they aren't. What I think Loki is also trying to tell them is, you're not in hell yet. You're in purgatory. We can get out of here. We could get free. And Dante's Inferno and Dante's Divine Comedy is also a story about refugees. So Dante writes the Divine Comedy from exile. He's politically exiled from Florence, where they have decided that he will be put to death.
Yikes.
He's already away from Florence at the time, but he gets news that they've sentenced him to death, And if he comes back, he's going to die. So he stays outside of Florence and writes the Divine Comedy, which is both a story about trying to find salvation, as much as it is about recognizing how frustrating it is to try to get back home when all of the powers are against you. And so who do you turn to find a way back home, whatever home is going to be? Right? For Dante, it's spiritual faith is going to sort of get him through the rest of his life and the writing of this book, which takes like 12 years. But it's a story about a refugee who's trying to figure out how to get home. And both of these are stories about that, debates about, am I stuck here? Are these people stuck here? Who's stuck where? Why are they stuck there? Because they committed deadly sins or because they made some mistakes? How do we find salvation in the midst of exile?
Okay.
We've talked about Milton and Paradise Lost before on the show, and I think my question to you is, why do these works have resonance even for a secular audience hundreds of years after they were written? People like us who just don't have any relationship to the idea that spiritual salvation is some kind of home.
That's a tough question to answer because there are diverging answers to that question. Like Venn diagram, we might find some overlap, but it's not one circle. So people might want to read the Divine Comedy and Paradise Lost because they're beautiful, even though they diverge ideologically from the way that we approach faith or approach politics or approach religion or, whatever. But one thing about the Divine Comedy that's resonant to today is that Dante tries to square a secular problem, the problem of being a political exile, with the problem of being a spiritual exile. Not that Dante is not a believer, but because he's trying to figure out how to believe in God. And I think a lot of modern readers, this is not for me, like I'm a very happy atheist. I know y'all are happy atheists, but not everybody's a happy atheist.
Right.
Some people want to have belief in a higher power that controls things, that makes everything rational and reasonable and good, even when things are horrible as shit. We're living in a pandemic. Maybe this was fated and we'll be okay. Like God gives us our toughest challenges or whatever, right? The sort of like language of faith that assumes that even when we're having a hard time, God is there with us. Right? And the Divine Comedy is a text that squares those two things, that being in political exile can be resolved through finding spirituality.
Yeah, in an episode where Lokis call themselves the god of outcasts, it feels like a person writing a story in exile definitely might have a lot to say about the same kind of themes and stories. What else did you see from episode 5?
Well, one thing that I'll also say about a parallel between the Divine Comedy and Loki is that they both realize, Loki the character and Dante the character in the Divine Comedy, both realize that the pathway to finding some sense of home is through friendship. It's not about individualized, glorious purpose. Right? Of course, that is what our other variant Loki is constantly invoking. It's not about finding glorious purpose. It's about finding purpose with others, the shared journey of friends. Dante can't get out of his lost state in the forest until Virgil arrives, and then they become friends.
So, Maeve, what is the main theme then of the Divine Comedy? Because we talk here on Storycast about themes. What is it and how does it tie into what we've seen so far in Loki?
Well, I think a lot of people would say that the main theme of the Divine Comedy is love. And it's probably, I haven't done a good data analysis of this. It's probably one of the most used words in the Divine Comedy, love. It's also a story, though, like I said, about friendship and about trusting other people. What does it mean to trust other people? And how can we instrumentalize that trust to get what we need, whatever it happens to be? In this case, it's finding home or salvation or being saved or whatever connected things. In the Divine Comedy, this takes a really important form. There's a moment in the Inferno where Dante and Virgil see a bunch of suffering individuals in hell, and Dante wants to talk to them, but he can't get down this embankment or something. And Virgil says to him, I can carry you. And Dante turns to him and says, whatever you think is right. So it's a moment of trust, of a kind of bodily trust where you consign your body to another human being and you trust that they won't drop you or betray you or whatever. And Loki, this episode of Loki is filled with moments where characters are trying to trust other characters with varying successes, right? Sylvie tries to trust Renslayer, reaches her hand out for a handshake. And then, of course, Renslayer, because Renslayer's Renslayer, is bound to betray Sylvie, which, of course, is like, you know, it's fucked up because the whole point of Loki, the way that Loki is viewed by the Time Authority is that he's a problem because you can't trust what he's going to do next. But the Time Authority is the one thing that you definitely can't trust. And this episode really solidifies that in really painful ways.
And it's one of the ongoing themes around Loki throughout the Thor series, which is that Thor continues to trust Loki over and over again, and Loki continues to betray him until he doesn't, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of fans criticize this, saying it annoys them that Thor trusts Loki, but that's all deliberate. And I think this show really digs into that criticism and says, hey, man, what Thor said about Loki, that there's something he sees in him deeper, turns out to have always been there.
So how do the characters compare across these works? Who matches up with whom, basically, from the Divine Comedy to Loki?
You know, the more I thought about it, I sent you that text message kind of just on the fly because I was like, God, it feels right to me. There's something here. Then the more I thought about it, I was like, oh, yeah, totally. Mobius is basically like Virgil because Mobius shows up at the beginning of this series and continues here to an extent to essentially guide Loki through the universe of the Timekeepers, for sure. But then also once he arrives in this purgatory space, he also performs a kind of guidance. Although what's kind of wonderful about this is that in the Divine Comedy, the guidance switches places just as it does here, where Loki is then also guiding Mobius. So Mobius is kind of Virgil. I mean, Sylvie is kind of Beatrice.
That's going to take some getting used to, Maeve.
Yeah, Beatrice. So, Beatrice in the Divine Comedy is Dante's love. It's Dante's actual love in the history of Dante's life, of a Florentine woman. But in the Divine Comedy, she shows up in paradise for her most extended visit in the text and guides Dante through paradise because Beatrice is without sin. And so performs the work of kind of explaining to Dante what paradise is and why it's so perfect and why it represents the perfect love that he has for her.
That's interesting because in this story, our Beatrice, Sylvie, is very skeptical of the idea of a kind of utopia at the end of time, right? When Renslayer tells her it's all going to be a wonderful, magnificent thing at the end, or that's what the Timekeepers have promised. I believe Sylvie's response is very believable, or sounds believable.
Yeah, she's our ironist in the episode. But she's also the one who understands the truth of things better than Loki does. So she's a kind of weird Beatrice. But there's one other character that I want to talk about that we haven't talked about yet. He's amazing, right? Alioth. He also has a parallel. So Alioth, as a character in the show, is insatiable in its appetites, right? It just devours everything that arrives. Mm-hmm. In the Divine Comedy, and a number of scholars have written about this, there are lots of dogs, tons of dogs for some reason, and lots of other monstrous creatures. So Alioth is like a monstrous creature that looks a little bit like a dog. There are a number of these in the Divine Comedy, and in all cases, the dogs represent, so there's Cerberus, right, which is in classical mythology, the dog that guards the underworld. And at the very beginning of the Divine Comedy, before Dante finds Virgil, he encounters a she-wolf that is emaciated and terrifying to Dante. Makes Dante cry. Not because Dante feels sad for the she-wolf, but because the she-wolf terrifies Dante. Virgil appears out of nowhere in the same way that he disappears at the end of Purgatory. He appears out of nowhere and explains to Dante that we should actually feel sorry for the she-wolf because the she-wolf is insatiable in their appetites, but it's not exactly their fault. They're just insatiable. They represent the sin of avarice in the way that the Cerberus figure in Dante's Inferno represents gluttony. And in both cases, the best way to get around Cerberus and the she-wolf is not to destroy them or attack them, but to distract them, to fill their mouths with something or just walk around, which has its own parallel because Sylvie recognizes that trying to kill this thing is not the answer. The answer is to try to distract it or take it over, using her enchantment powers.
So if I'm following, the Divine Comedy is basically a story of an exile who is making his way through the afterlife, which is very similar to our Loki, who is now an exile from the sacred timeline and making his way through whatever we call this space outside of space and time. And there's a theme that you find both in Loki and the Divine Comedy, which is this idea of learning how to trust people as a component of your salvation, of friendship, essentially being the thing that will help you ascend and trusting other people. And as Amanda pointed out, maybe not being such a piece of shit betrayer to everybody in your life all the time. But what about the ways these two works diverge? Are there any ways where they sort of reflect opposite ideas to each other?
I mean, this is the best part of it, right? Like that's all adaptation. Best part of all adaptation is not where they mimic, but where they diverge. So there's enough mimicry that we can say, oh yeah, this looks like that thing. But these are different stories. Now, Sylvie is the first place that it matters. And you brought up a minute ago, and I was like, oh, I could go there, or we could just wait a sec.
Oh, okay, yeah. I was jumping ahead accidentally here.
Beatrice in the Divine Comedy is cast as a kind of ideal love object, right? She only arrives basically substantially in paradise to guide Dante through, and she knows a lot of stuff, right? Like she can tell him everything about paradise, like here's what is here and here's what is here, and she's an explainer, right? But she doesn't transform Dante. Dante is done, he's like basically done transforming. Virgil has made that possible.
Got it.
His dude friends have helped him become a better man. Virgil, God, those ones have made him a better man.
Sure.
But Beatrice is there as an idealized love object who helps him because he truly loves her experience paradise to the fullest.
It's a sexist stereotype, though. There's just no way around it. Like, women put on that kind of pedestal make all other women look bad.
Yeah, and we see this in epic narrative all the time. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Una is the love object, right? She represents the true church, much like Beatrice, like perfect faithfulness to dogma. Not a person like Sylvie, who's a renegade. She's a rebel. She's a revolutionary.
Yeah,
and she changes Loki in this story. And there's one really subtle key difference. And my suspicion is a lot of people notice this when watching Loki. In the last, 10 minutes maybe of the episode, maybe 5 minutes, Loki stops talking about himself as I and starts referring to we. This is a story of us. And Sylvie has inaugurated that transition because she's the one who's like, we can't kill him. We've got to work together to figure out a way to pacify this monstrous dog thing that's going to eat everything, snake, whatever it is, right? In the Divine Comedy, and I checked this today because I was like, ooh, I gotta know. Like Dante has been through everything, and he's only been able to do it because Virgil's there, because Beatrice is there, and in the end, because God is there, right? The final canto of the Divine Comedy is divided into, 100 cantos or whatever. 3 books, 100 cantos. That final canto, nobody else is there. Beatrice is referred to in the final canto, but the entire thing is written in the first person.
Yeah.
Dante is still the individual who's been saved, basically done his own saving. Yeah, whatever. He's got some friends and that's great. But this is an individual project. There is something weird about the syntax of the end of this episode of Loki. It sounds, every time he said it, it was like, sounds weird. And I think it's purposeful. It's a recognition of what happens when you really bind together with friends and lovers, and you do the thing that you can only do with others.
I mean, it underscores what I think is probably the most obvious divergence between these two texts, which is Dante is a true believer in God, a Christian through and through, somebody whose poem is about faith in God and functionally, therefore, faith in the institutional teachings of the Catholic Church, right? This show is a no gods, no masters show, if ever there was one. Literally, it is about following a god in his humiliations and being brought to earth and turned into functionally a mortal man, right? And like it's decloaking this god figure. And basically, again, the further and further you get to the center of the story, we've seen the timekeepers got dethroned as gods over and over again. So, I would say that like Sylvie being a flawed human woman, unlike Beatrice in Inferno,
Beatrice in Divine Comedy, kind of also underscores that, because it's very much about like this, like I talked about a little bit in the last episode, but kind of more in depth, this notion that love, especially like erotic love between friends, those kinds of love are a real threat to these kinds of social orders, because they unmask the hierarchy. If people's relationships to each other are about love and not power, it's a threat to oppressive social structures.
Yeah, it's beautifully said. And I think that's exactly right on, because what makes this show so different from something like the Divine Comedy is that its vision of love, its vision of friendship is fundamentally, radically distinctive. For Dante, God's love is the first love on which humans model their connections to other humans. So God loves man. So then we go out into the world and then we love that way. And it's funny because the entire Divine Comedy, which I realized today, because I haven't ever thought about it in quite these terms, is bookended with this. So the very beginning of the Divine Comedy refers to when love divine first moved. So love divine starts everything, and then we all go and do love divine if we're good, and if we don't, and that's what happens in the Inferno. Basically, everybody doesn't know how to love. They self-love too much, lots of onanism in the Inferno, or they love for the wrong reasons. It's a perverted love. So Dante discovers love over the course of the Inferno. But again, at the very end, it's again God's love that is the model for love everywhere. He says in the very last stanza of the Inferno, here vigor failed the towering fantasy, the whole entire story of the Divine Comedy. But yet the will rolled onward like a wheel in even motion by the love impelled that moves the sun and heaven and all the stars. God's love moves everything. Loki is different. Love is not prescribed by a higher being. It is organic and it's expansive. It includes romantic love, but it's not limited to that. So we were right when we said before that the relationship between Loki and Sylvie is weird because it doesn't translate instantaneously into romantic love. It pulls back from that space of mere erotic attachment and becomes this bigger thing that is a model for how we survive. And if that's not a story that is rebellious against the vision of God's love being the only thing that tells us what to do or how to be, I don't know what is.
Well, and it's pretty explicit. The timekeepers are as close to an analog of the God of the Christian church as you could possibly get in this show. Yeah. And they are fake and they are toxic and they are hateful. Yeah. And it's only the perverse love and the onanism that is actually pure in the show.
It gets dragged out of the Inferno and up into the sky and then defeats everything. So onanism is good, guys. It's powerful.
I feel like you guys are overlooking the one truly pious creature in this entire episode, which is Alligator Loki, who actually prays in this episode. Yes. So really, perhaps Alligator Loki is our Dante, the true hero of the entire episode.
Yeah, he's a real problem though, because like basically, like he can't talk, and his most explicit form of expression is chewing off the hand of evil Loki, which is funny.
Funny you should mention
sends
that.
a message.
Yeah, but doesn't the devil in the Divine Comedy, isn't he always eating Cassius and Brutus?
That's true, actually. That's true. And, Cerberus is always trying to eat bits of other beings. Yeah, fair.
But of course I kid. We all know Alligator Loki will not feature until season 2 of Loki, which I'm 100% sure will be about him. And in case you missed it, we did get Frog Thor in this episode. As you pan down into the hidden layer of the Lokis underground, poor Frog Thor is in that little jar trying to get out. So he is also some sort of a variant, and
I'm holding out for Cat Thor.
Yeah, holding out for Cat Thor. That would be great.
Then we know Squirrel Girl's a character.
Yes!
But Throg is a character from the MCU, so it's always possible we're going to get the Pet Avengers one of these days. Never say die. But let's step more specifically into the themes of this episode. I'm going to turn to you, Amanda. Help me understand, for this episode specifically, what was the main theme or idea driving it?
It's the one I think driving the entire series, which is what makes a Loki a Loki. And really by that, I mean, like, what makes somebody who they are? And more importantly, what does it mean to change? Is change even possible? Like, I think a lot of the time when we talk about people changing, and usually we're talking about change for the better, very few people want to change for the worse. It does bring up all these questions about identity. Who am I? If I change, am I the same person? And I think on TV shows, a lot of time change is sort of treated, like especially sitcoms and stuff, human growth is just treated as this unalloyed good. And this show, I think it's closer to the reality of how people actually feel about change a lot of the time. Even if they think it's good, it threatens identity. I mean, if you've ever had to get help for a mental health problem, if you've ever wanted to end a relationship or start a relationship, if your job wasn't working out for you and you wanted to change careers, you wanted to move, all these things we all know have this like profound ability to change who we are, and that threatens our sense of identity. And I think this show is actually asking some pretty profound and deep questions about what it means to change while staying the same person. And it literalizes it in like dozens of Lokis who are all very different from each other and yet still somehow Loki. In the way that, I mean, this Loki in this episode runs around with a young Loki, an old Loki, and an alligator Loki. But I mean, I think it couldn't have underscored more how we're very different person from who we were as a child and who we are as an old person, and yet somehow are functionally the same person.
And also not that like slightly stupid version of all of this, which is in the world of pop psychology or whatever, where it's like, well, your cells change over every, 7 years or whatever. So you're a totally different person. No problem. It's like, yeah, but we have memory. There's a whole thing like this we call memory that gives us a sense of self. And when things change, like we have to confront the relationship between the present and the past.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not, and it's why change is hard. Because I think, especially the older I get, the more I really realize how much identity drives so much of our motivations in life is trying to sort of conform our behavior and our beliefs and our friendships and our environment in general to our self-image of who we are.
Yeah.
And when that self-image is threatened, people can act really poorly.
Midlife crisis. Uh-huh.
Yeah. And I think Loki is a real good example of someone whose self-image has been thoroughly challenged in this series. So
speaking of that, then, tell me about the key scene or component of the story in episode 5 that crystallized this theme, or drove it home for you.
So, yay, Richard Grant being old Loki because he killed it. And I think his journey in this episode really encapsulated this theme. after that kind of fight between all the Lokis, which is one of the most Rick and Morty moments of this season, he goes on this rant where he's like, glorious purpose, arg. And he says Loki's, basically, I'm paraphrasing. He says Loki's are always betraying each other, always backstabbing, and then says, quote, we can't change. We're broken. Every version of us. And then Kid Loki chimes in by saying, and anyone who tries to fix themselves, we're sent here to die. And this was a scene of kind of exactly that profound feeling I think a lot of us who want to change but are struggling have had, where we feel like I can't change. Change is impossible. There's no way to square the change I want in my life with my image of myself. I'm fundamentally broken. There is no change here.
And I might as well just accept defeat.
Exactly. And then at the end, he does, but he's already actually a changed man. He has his monologue about him removing himself from the universe, which was a pretty good metaphor for depression, but that's because he had realization about himself. And then at the end, of course, he realizes, oh, actually, I can be better. And that's epitomized by him reframing what the idea of glorious purpose is, away from this fascistic notion he'd always clung to, oh, I can actually sacrifice myself and save the world. I can be a good person.
Yeah, die for the greater good.
It's a wonderful moment because it's a perfect reversal of the conversation that he has with Mobius, where he says, we have but one part to play, the god of outcasts, right? Like that's just a sign of defeat, a sign of what we might even think of as a kind of clinical depression. Like we have one part to play, the god of outcasts. We have no purpose here. We're just here to float in space and then die. Right. So his final act of self-sacrifice is a recognition that he has more power in the world, and he has power through change. By self-transformation, he becomes this powerful being again. And it's almost godlike, his creating of Asgard. Right? It's beautiful.
Well, you talked when we were watching, Amanda, about the idea of these fights between these Lokis and watching characters like classic Loki defeat themselves before they start as a metaphor for this kind of self-sabotage that we're all capable of, both as a way to stop change that we might be afraid of, but also because we all might struggle at various times with different levels of depression or self-esteem issues or all of that. And it was really interesting to think about this as a battle for the psyche.
Yeah, I mean, they're literally inside a space that was like an embodiment of Loki's kind of internal self. And then all these versions of Loki are fighting each other, but they're all just toxic assholes. And and it really was just the manifestation of what, folks on the internet call jerk brain.
Oh, man.
Right. Which is like your brain, when people are struggling with these kinds of mental health issues or trying to change or whatever, their brain just saying it's useless. You'll never be different. You'll never get better. And it made me laugh, but I was just like, this is just almost too perfect of an illustration of this in the kind of most literal sense.
Well, and even in that moment where, Loki plays out this story about how they could defeat this, they could get through, and he's like, are you with me? And they start laughing at him. That is the kind of thing that happens for folks who are depressed, where they have this feeling of confidence and then they tear themselves down, right? The sort of inability to stay with the optimism of a future that is something other than self-defeat or purposelessness. Or
Christine has been talking on Character Cast about how Mobius plays the role of Loki's therapist. And he really did it again, but this time for old Loki. And what's great about Mobius is that he, unlike Loki, who goes through these huge, dramatic, narcissistic, fights with himself about change, Mobius is the kind of person, and we've all met this person. Sometimes we've possibly been this person who new information or a change happens and they just go with it. And it's easy for them. They can change who they are. They are adaptable. They are flexible and resilient. And that is Mobius. And he, old Loki's just kind of shocked by him and says, just like that, you're turning on the very thing you devoted your life to, just like that, right?
Yeah.
And Mobius just looks at him and he's like, never too late to change. And it was just like that for him. And you can see the look on Richard Grant's face as he thinks about this. Maybe sometimes we make such a big deal out of change that we make it too hard for ourselves. We could just actually be like, why not?
What about Sylvie? How does she factor into the theme of change and trying to find this way to improvement?
I mean, Sylvie's self-image is as a loner.
Yeah.
It's obviously a protective shield built around herself to tell her an ego-saving story about what is actually a tragic story of somebody who's been alone. And now she actually has friends, and so she has to reconcile this image of herself as a loner with the fact that she isn't alone anymore. And she does it. Again, Sylvie is probably the most mentally healthy of the Lokis.
Yeah.
So while she struggles with it, she lets Loki wrap the blanket around her.
Right.
And also just who she is has always symbolized the potential for change. She's changed her name. She doesn't even go by the name Loki anymore. And yet still somehow deep down inside, she's a Loki. And I think that this is a story of how people can profoundly change and yet still somehow be themselves.
I think this is good evidence, though, that, you were saying before that Mobius is, a character who changes dramatically, which he does. But I think Sylvie is maybe the best example of a character who changes fundamentally, right? She's gone from being, if anybody's a refugee in this story, it's Sylvie.
Right.
She's been alone, she says, to Mobius in the car, in the pizza car, which is amazing little detail. In the pizza car, she's like, you created orphans.
Yeah.
You tried to kill orphans. She is somebody who's had profound loss, and regardless of that, is capable of changing into somebody who can love and be loved. I can't imagine a more profound change from that.
And it comes back to that conversation with her and Loki when she turns to him after he does the blanket moment that you talked about, Amanda. She just says, "Thank you." And you get the sense that might be the first time she's ever just been able to express gratitude without expecting to be double-crossed or betrayed or have somebody try to take something from her. Felt like a really special moment for her and for our Loki.
And it was for him too, right? Because she asked him, how will I know that you're not going to betray me in the end? And he says to her, I'm a different person now.
Yeah.
And he proves it. I mean, and I think that there's this is a story about how we change and how we can kind of be better people, better versions of ourselves while still being ourselves.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is through things like our relationships, love, these kind of anchoring concepts that have been throughout the series, kind of held out as ways that we can kind of be anchored to ourselves.
And it's profound because so many of the narratives that are written about how we change ourselves are written as narratives of what we call self-care. But sometimes other care is the way that we and others change.
Well, but in this story, they're one and the same, right?
Yeah.
Because the whole point, like, Loki and Sylvie love each other, but they are the same person. So it is a very extended metaphor for self-discovery. And I think that, at the end, what you have all these different Lokis kind of coming together. And it's like, on one hand, it's like a kind of classic, as if it was a Joss Whedon story about how we're stronger as a team. Yeah. But actually, it's a story about how you have strength in you that you don't even know, as long as you look inside and really discover who your true self is. Yeah. Which is, I think, like Loki says, we're stronger than we think we are.
Yeah.
Before we move on, I just want to ask real quick, what about the folks back at the TVA? Because we do spend some time with B-15 and with Renslayer and all that. Miss Minutes is back there, of course. Did you see anything in the TVA scenes that fit this idea?
As with Mobius, who gets new information and just goes ahead and changes his worldview, B-15 does exactly the same thing. She had this profound insight. She says that changes everything. She discovered that the timekeepers aren't real, or that they're different than she thought they were. She just, and she incorporated this new information and changed herself and changed her worldview. Renslayer is kind of an interesting example of how a lot of people actually do react to change and new information, which is that they shut down because the threat to their self-esteem and their self-image is such that they can't make the change, even in the face of new information. And, not to make everything about politics, even though I'm a politics writer, I think we as a nation are grappling very deeply with this problem right now, which is we're seeing conservative America just gradually lose its mind because they can't incorporate new information into their worldview. And instead, like Renslayer, who's going to just continue to act like the timekeepers are real, even though she knows they're not.
Yeah.
They're just going to persist and holding, and they're going to lie and lie and lie. And just because the lie is more comforting than the truth that they just cannot accept.
Which is what Loki says to Mobius in the last episode about you're just lying to yourself. And we see Renslayer do that in this episode very explicitly because Sylvie has explained to her, like, here's one way. We can't get there via time pad. There's one way to get there. And Sylvie does it. She prunes herself. And, the other sort of, guys who are around Renslayer are like, she pruned herself. And she's like, Renslayer says, good, she's dead. And it's like, no. You have even rewritten the biggest threat to you and the order that you represent, because the order that you represent is so important to you that you refuse to even recognize that there's a threat here, because who prunes themselves? Nobody.
Well, I think that also might have primed those TVA agents to be more open to Mobius's ideas or B-15's ideas if and when they get their hooks in these folks by coming back and burning the TVA to the ground, as Mobius says. Well, Amanda, what about a work of film or literature that you feel is closely related to the episode's theme of change?
Well, there's so many. I mean, but from the visual language and dialogue of the show, they were wanting us to think about one very important work, which is The Wizard of Oz. Probably really more the movie than the Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the book. We hear the man behind the curtain language. The Alioth is very much visualized as like a tornado, like the kind that takes Dorothy to Oz. It was really obvious when old Loki created Asgard, which already kind of looked like the Emerald City in The Wizard of Oz, but when it's bathed in green, it looks exactly like the Emerald City. Because classic Loki's magic does the green overlay when he's building it, so it looks just like the Emerald City. That's a great call. Yeah.
Well, and even through the clouds, it looks when Alioth dissipates to let them through, it's got a kind of green tint to the place they're going to.
Yeah, and that last shot of the two of them walking through the gate towards that castle is a strong echo of the shot of Dorothy and her friends walking towards the Emerald City. And it's been echoed in many fantasy movies since then, especially like going to Mordor and Lord of the Rings and things like that. But like, I don't know for a fact that shot in The Wizard of Oz is the first of ever those shots, but it's probably the most famous of all those kinds of shots. And many fantasy stories, the idea of our character going into this universe that they had no idea existed, this world that was outside of their experience and going on a journey, is a really common one in fantasy. And often, probably exclusively, these stories are metaphors for that journey of self-identity, self-discovery. The Wizard of Oz, it's a children's story, so it's pretty on the nose. Dorothy literally meets aspects of herself along the way. The scarecrow that needs a brain, the Tin Man that needs a heart, the lion that needs courage. And these are all the things that actually Dorothy needs, right?
Right.
And the things that Dorothy develops in her journey. And at the end of at the end of the road, when the character needs to go home, which of course is always a symbol for their true self that they're returning to, having gone on this journey, she's told by the Good Witch that she always had the capacity the whole time. It was always inside her, symbolized by the red slippers. And just like in The Wizard of Oz, Loki realizes at the end of this episode that he's always had the capacity to do this in himself. Yeah. He's told by Sylvie that he can enchant because he's Loki. It's always been part of him.
Yeah. For folks who don't know, the episode titled Journey into Mystery is a shout out to the comics where Loki and Thor and Jane Foster all first appeared in Marvel Comics. But what else is The Wizard of Oz? What else is the Divine Comedy besides a journey into mystery? So I feel like that ties in.
What's fun about the two is that I think like the Divine Comedy is kind of a more classical version, like the sort of epic poems that are journeys following a certain character are often a little bit more political or social. They're about, in ancient world and even in medieval times, they're often stories that are telling people, the listeners, about their social values, about their community myths or values.
They're cosmological too. They're about the entire universe of their world.
Then at some point, narratives became more insular and psychological, popular stories. And so something like The Wizard of Oz or The Lord of the Rings or basically most popular fantasy stories of our era are more psychological. They're about a person's internal journey, about them. It's always a metaphor. Dorothy starting as a child, becoming a woman, that kind of thing.
So this episode begins with this totally weird moment, cinematographically, where the world, we're shot from above and then it starts twisting upside down and we're upside down and then the elevator appears in front of us. It felt to me, you were talking about Wizard of Oz, the first thing I started thinking about was Alice in Wonderland, right? A story that is about a girl turned upside down, falls through a hole, follows a rabbit, and then discovers herself and discovers the power she has to overturn a queen, right? So Loki is Alice. It's a wonderful variation of this idea that when the world turns upside down, maybe we see all the things that keep us from having the power we're supposed to have, the power that we've always had inside of us, that we can then instrumentalize and then turn the world into something that is maybe made a little bit more for us, as opposed to made against us or made without us or made hoping that we disappear.
And it is one of the most popular stories in fantasy, right?
Totally.
This show owes a lot to the Doctor Who series, and that was going to be obvious from the beginning because it's timey-wimey crap.
Yeah.
But actually...
I love Doctor Who.
I love Doctor Who. But it actually borrows something a little bit more basic from those stories, which is every Doctor Who story is about ordinary person on Earth living a limited life. And then the Doctor comes swooping into their life and they become an adventurer. And in the process, they discover how much better of a person they can be, how much bigger they are, how much smarter they are than they ever gave themselves a chance to believe.
Well, the funny thing about Doctor Who, and I haven't thought about this in a lot of detail yet, but you were talking about this and I was thinking, a lot of the Doctor Who characters, and this is very classic of British television fiction, the characters that come along with him are middle class or working class characters. And so there's a class dimension to the critique of Doctor Who, that people can find themselves outside of commerce, outside of time, outside of the history of capitalism. And so there's a different critique that's happening in Doctor Who than what's happening here, which isn't to say that one is better than the other, but that there's
you
something.
can argue it's very similar in this, which is Loki's blinkered thinking throughout his life is very much the result of being so embedded in Asgardian society
and hierarchies.
They're literally a feudalist society, not a capitalist society, but the same kind of functional problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those hierarchies that sort of dictate where people's lives or how people's lives are circumscribed.
But even kind of pulling away some of the political and economic things, I think there's a deeper story there about how we all need to be able to sort of step outside of the roles that we've been assigned by other people in our lives.
Yeah.
To experiment with who we can be in order to find who we really are. Like, it's so important to experiment. And I think that that's what all these different Lokis are, right? All the variants are Loki experiments. Kid Loki's very clear. We were all trying to make ourselves better.
Yeah.
Well, this is an incredible discussion, as always. But Amanda, if people are hoping that their QAnon uncle can change and that it's never too late to give up on that guy, where can they talk to you about these ideas of change and hoping for us to become the better version of ourselves?
You can find me on Twitter, but I warn you, I'm going to tell you need to throw your QAnon uncle to the end of time and make him run away from a smoke monster. And that's probably the only thing that'll wake him up. But I'm on Twitter at Amanda Marcotte.
And Maeve, if people want to talk to you about descents into the afterlife and the appropriate way to pronounce names like Beatrice, where can they find and follow you?
I'm happy to be your Virgil. Maybe just a little bit. On Twitter at Maeve Adams, MaeveAdams.
All right, Audio Avengers, that's our show for today. We have a ton more of Loki Episode 5 to discuss with Character Cast on Monday and Pondervision before that on Saturday. But we also have one more episode of Loki left, so that'll get us one more round of these shows, and then we'll go on our summer schedule as we get into What If and those animated shows that we're all looking forward to. They haven't told us when they're coming, we don't exactly know what the schedule is, and it's the summer, and there's a bunch of travel and other things going on. So I don't know exactly what our schedule will be for What If, but we'll play it fast and loose. Just trust that we'll be here popping in from time to time to talk about those episodes. In the meantime...
And we will not betray you.
Yeah, we will not betray
Never,
you.
friends.
In the meantime, if you're enjoying the show, leave us one of those 5-star Apple reviews so we can rise in those search rankings. And if you want to talk more with me, you can find me on the Marvelous TV Club Facebook page, on the Marvelous TV Club Instagram page, on the Marvelous TV Club Twitter page, all at Marvelous TV Club, or follow me on Twitter at Mark Folletti. That's Mark with a C. All right, team, let's go exploring at the end of time. What is the worst that could happen?